The shovel hit stone again. Elsie felt the vibration travel up through her palms, into her wrists, settling into the bones of her shoulders like a reminder that the earth did not want her here either. She exhaled slowly, her breath rising in a pale thread against the cold morning air, and adjusted her grip. Then she lifted the shovel and drove it down once more. Around her, the village of Ashfen woke to its usual sounds: the creak of hinges, the low complaint of cattle, the distant laughter of children chasing each other through the frost-bitten lanes. None of those sounds came near the eastern edge of the village, where the ground was hard and the soil thin, and the light arrived last. That was where Elsie worked. That was where she had always been placed. She was 23 years old and had been digging this well for 11 days. Her coat was a man's coat, too wide at the shoulders and too short at the wrists, the wool worn nearly smooth at the elbows. Her boots were cracked at the left sole, and she had wrapped that foot in an extra strip of cloth to keep the mud out. Her dark hair was pulled back with a length of twine. Her hands, bare because gloves were a luxury she had traded away last winter for a bag of grain, were calloused and red from the cold. She did not look like someone the pack respected. She was not. Elsie was the last Omega in Ashfen, a word the pack used the way they used other words, like burden and charity case, and why is she still here? She had no family left. Her mother had passed 4 winters ago. Her father had never stayed long enough to matter. She lived in the small stone structure at the edge of the village that had once been a storage room for dried herbs. And she paid for that roof by mending clothes, hauling water from the river, and doing whatever tasks the others considered beneath them. Hauling water. That was what had started this. 3 weeks ago, the river that fed Ashfen, the Carrow, cold and gray and reliable as stone, had begun to drop. Slowly at first, then faster. The banks receded, the current thinned. The village council, made up of 3 senior wolves whose patience for problems ran shorter than their attention spans, had declared it a temporary change in weather and told everyone to reduce their usage until the rains returned. The rains had not returned. Elsie had watched the river. She had walked its edges for 2 mornings in a row, studying where the water moved and where it did not, feeling the ground with her palms the way her mother had once taught her. Her mother had not been a great woman by the pack's measure, but she had known water. She had known how land breathed, where it held moisture deep and hidden, where it was willing to give if you were willing to ask. Elsie had found a place, right here, on the eastern edge, where no one else went, and the soil changed color from pale gray to something darker. She had told Elder Brom. Elder Brom had laughed, not cruelly, or perhaps it was, and he had simply stopped caring about the difference. He had laughed the way people laugh at something so absurd it doesn't even deserve argument. An Omega wants to dig a well. Here. In the hardest ground in the valley. He had gone back to his fire, and his 2 companions had gone with him, and their laughter had trailed out behind them like smoke. So Elsie had started digging alone. By the 4th day, her arms shook every evening. By the 7th, 2 young wolves had come to watch, not to help, but to observe, the way people observe someone walking toward the edge of something, waiting to see if they fall. One of them had said something she did not quite catch, and both had laughed. She had kept digging. By the 11th morning, the hole was deep enough that she had to use a rope ladder to climb in and out. The soil down here was darker and colder, and smelled of minerals and deep thyme. And when she pressed her palm flat against the earth wall, she felt the faint suggestion of something. Not yet water, but the memory of water. The shape the ground made when it was holding something back. She drove the shovel down, hit stone, moved 2 hand widths to the left, drove it down again. And this time the resistance was different. The sound was different. The shovel did not ring against rock. It sank just slightly, into something that gave. Elsie went very still. She pressed her boot carefully against the loosened earth, and a thin dark line appeared between the soil and the stone. and then, slowly, like a secret being told against its will, water began to seep through. She stood there at the bottom of her 11-day hole and watched cold water rise around the edges of her boots, and she did not cry. She had stopped crying at things like this a long time ago. But her chest tightened in a way that was not entirely unlike grief, and not entirely unlike relief. She had found it. She climbed out using the rope, her arms shaking, her coat wet from the knees down, mud on her face and in her hair. She stood at the rim of the well and looked at the sky, which was white and closed and gave nothing away. Then she looked toward the village. Elder Brom's hall was visible from here, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Warm inside, full of people who had made their decision about her years ago. She would tell them. They would come and look. They might even thank her, in the small, grudging way people thank those they have never quite believed in, quickly, as if gratitude given too freely might obligate them to something more. She did not need their gratitude. She picked up her shovel and walked back toward the village. She was halfway through the lane between the granary and the tanner's shed when she became aware that something had changed. It was not a sound exactly. Or not only a sound. It was a shift in the air. The way the village had gone quieter than a village full of people had any right to be. Doors that had been open were now half closed. A woman who had been hanging laundry had stopped mid-motion, a shirt still in her hands, her eyes fixed on the road that entered Ashven from the north. Elsie stopped walking. She looked at the road. 3 riders. The first 2 were large and rode in close formation, their cloaks dark, their horses the color of iron. Their posture was the posture of men who were used to being the most dangerous thing in any room they entered. They did not look at the village people. They looked at the perimeter. They looked at rooftops. They looked at alleys. The third rider came between them and slightly behind, which was strange, because everything about the third rider said that he did not belong in the back of anything. He was tall in the saddle in the way that certain men are tall even sitting down, as if height were a habit rather than a measurement. His cloak was black and heavy, and moved in the wind with a weight that spoke of quality. His hands on the reins were unhurried. His horse, a dark animal with a white mark on its face, walked with the careful deliberateness of a creature that had been trained to carry something worth preserving. Elsie could not see his face from this distance. She could see that the entire village was behaving as if breathing loudly might cause a problem. Elder Brom had appeared at the door of his hall. He was not laughing now. He was smoothing the front of his vest with both hands, moving toward the road with the haste of a man who wanted to appear as if he had not been hurrying. The riders stopped at the entrance to the main square. The third rider swung down from the horse with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and when he turned to hand the reins to one of his men, Elsie finally saw his face. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked as if it had been decided rather than grown. His eyes, even from this distance, were a pale color, gray or something close to it, and they moved across the village square with the calm, systematic attention of someone conducting an assessment rather than a visit. He looked at the square. He looked at the hall. He looked at Elder Brom, who had arrived and was now bowing and speaking rapidly with the expression of a man offering explanations no one had asked for. And then, and Elsie did not know why she was still standing in the lane watching this. She should have gone the other way. Those pale eyes moved, just slightly, and found her. She was a muddy woman with a shovel and a borrowed coat standing between a granary and a tanner's shed, and somehow she had become the thing he was looking at. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She did not look away. He turned back to Elder Brom. One of the escort riders leaned down and said something quietly to the other, and both of them glanced in her direction. Elsie became acutely aware of the mud on her face, and the water still dripping from the hem of her coat, and the fact that she was holding a shovel as though it were a walking stick. She turned and walked away before she could do anything more embarrassing, but the back of her neck stayed warm for a long time after. Inside the hall, Elder Brom was already regretting every decision he had made in the last month. The man standing across from him was Leander, and that was all anyone in the outer territories needed to know. Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, sovereign of 11 packs, the man who had ended the border wars without negotiating, which was another way of saying he had won them. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He asked questions in a tone that made silence feel like the wrong answer. "When did the Caro begin to recede?" Leander asked. 3 weeks past, my lord, Brom said. "And your current water situation?" A pause. Brom wished he had filled faster. "We are managing." Leander looked at him. "We are addressing the matter," Brom corrected. "I passed a woman," Leander said, "on the lane near your eastern edge. She was carrying a shovel and appeared to have been underground recently." He said it without inflection, as a fact being filed. "What was she doing?" Brom opened his mouth, closed it. "She dug a well," he said finally. "On the eastern side. The ground there is, we did not believe it would." He stopped. "She found water." The pause that followed was not long, but it had weight. "And Omega found water," Leander said, "while your council was managing the situation." It was not a question. Brom said nothing. Leander turned toward the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. "I will need to see it," he said. "Tomorrow, at first light. And I will need to speak with her." Nobody told Elsie that the Alpha King wanted to speak with her. She found out the way she found out most things in Ashfen, by accident, and too late to prepare. She was at the well before sunrise, reinforcing the stone rim she had begun laying the afternoon before, when she heard footsteps on the frozen ground behind her, and turned to find 2 of Leander's escort riders standing 3 paces away, watching her work with expressions that gave nothing away. "The Alpha King requests your presence at the eastern well," the taller one said. Elsie looked at him. Then she looked down at herself. Same coat, same cracked boots, hands raw from the cold and the stonework. She had not slept well. There was grit under her fingernails, and a bruise forming along her left forearm, where she had misjudged the placement of a stone block the evening before. "I am at the eastern well," she said. The rider blinked. "Yes," he said, after a moment. "That is correct." She turned back to the stone she had been positioning and pressed it carefully into the mortar she had mixed from river clay and ash. She heard the 2 riders exchange a glance behind her. She did not turn around again. Leander arrived 20 minutes later, alone. She heard the horse first, the careful, measured steps of a large animal moving slowly over frozen ground. Then silence as he dismounted. Then footsteps, unhurried, until they stopped at the edge of the well. She was inside the well itself, on the rope ladder, checking the depth of the water that had continued to rise through the night. She looked up. He was looking down. The morning light was behind him, which meant she could see the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, but not the expression on his face. He was wearing a gray wool traveling coat this morning, simpler than the cloak of the night before, and he had come without the escort. That detail caught in her mind and stayed there. "How deep?" he asked. His voice was lower than she had expected, not loud, simply carrying, the way a river carries without effort. 4 arm lengths to the surface of the water, she said. "It rose through the night. It will keep rising." "How do you know it will keep rising?" She climbed up 3 rungs of the rope ladder so she could see him better. His expression was the same as it had been in the square. Careful, neutral, attentive. The pale gray eyes moved over the stonework at the rim, over the mortar lines, over the rope she had anchored to an iron stake driven into the ground. "Because of where I dug," she said. "The ground changes here. The soil is darker. It holds moisture differently from the rest of the valley. And beneath the stone layer, there is a vein of water that does not depend on the Caro. It feeds from somewhere else, higher up." He was quiet for a moment. "You tested this?" I walked the eastern ridge for 2 mornings, she said. The moss grows differently up there. The soil temperature changes. And there is a kind of stone, dark gray, almost blue, that appears where underground water runs close to the surface. Another pause. Who taught you that? He asked. My mother. He looked at the well again. Then, without any announcement of what he was doing, he crouched at the rim and pressed one bare hand flat against the earth beside it. The same gesture she had made 11 days ago, reading the ground. He held it there for several seconds, eyes closed. She watched him from the rope ladder and said nothing. When he opened his eyes, he looked at her directly. There are 4 other settlements in the northern valley, he said. The Caro feeds all of them. If it continues to drop at this rate, by midwinter, they will all be in crisis. He stood, brushing the dirt from his palm. I need to know if this vein extends further east. Elsie considered this carefully. I don't know, she said honestly. I would need to walk the ridge further. 3, maybe 4 days of walking. Then you will walk it, he said. It was not a command exactly. Or if it was the kind that expected to be evaluated before being accepted. I will need supplies, she said. And I will need someone who can read a map, because I cannot. You will have both, he said. He looked at the stone rim she had built, then back at her. Your name? Elsie. Elsie, he repeated, as if placing it somewhere specific. I am told the council did not support this. He gestured at the well. She met his eyes. They laughed, she said simply. Something moved across his expression. Not quite anger, not quite anything she had a word for. It came and went quickly. Yes, he said. I imagine they did. He picked up the horse's reins and turned to leave, then stopped. Eat before you come to the hall. You look like you have not eaten since you started digging. She opened her mouth. He was already walking away. She looked down at the rising water in the well, then back at his retreating figure, and decided that whatever this day was becoming, it was not what she had planned. The hall felt different with Leander in it. Elsie noticed this when she arrived an hour later, having eaten a heel of bread and changed nothing about her appearance because she had nothing better to change into. The usual noise of the hall, the overlapping conversations, the scrape of benches, the casual assertion of space by the larger wolves, had organized itself into something more deliberate. People sat straighter, spoke more carefully, laughed only when they were certain it was appropriate. Elder Brom was at the long table near the fire, flanked by the 2 other council members, Hadric, broad and slow, and a woman named Senna, whose eyes moved quickly and trusted nothing they saw. Leander sat across from them, not at the head of the table, simply at one side of it, which somehow made the head of the table irrelevant. His second-in-command stood against the far wall. Elsie had learned his name from the riders. Cato. He was younger than Leander, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and an expression that said he had already identified every exit and assessed every person in the room as either a threat or a variable. When Elsie entered, his gaze moved to her and stayed there for a beat longer than neutral attention required. She ignored it and took the empty seat Leander indicated with a slight movement of his hand. Brom looked at her the way he had looked at the well when she had first told him about it, as if he was still waiting for the part where he could dismiss her. The survey of the eastern ridge, Leander said, addressing the table but looking at Elsie. I want it completed before the month turns. If the water vein is as extensive as I believe, we will need to identify 3 additional well sites to serve the lower settlements. He paused. Elsie will lead the survey. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture. Brom cleared his throat. My lord, with respect, surely one of the senior trackers would be better suited to... The senior trackers, Leander said. Without raising his voice, did not find the water vein. Brom closed his mouth. Cato, from his position against the wall, said nothing. But Elsie noticed that his eyes moved from Leander to her with an expression that was not hostility. It was closer to evaluation, the kind that had not yet decided what it was evaluating. "The survey party," Leander continued, "will include 2 of my writers for safety, a cartographer from my staff, and Elsie." He looked at Brom. "Your council will provide supplies and a pack horse." "Of course," Brom said. Elsie sat very still. She had spent 3 years in Ashven being assigned to the tasks no one else wanted: hauling water, mending torn leather, clearing snow from doorways that were not her own. She had done all of it without complaint, not because she lacked pride, but because she understood that survival and dignity sometimes had to take turns. This was not a task no one else wanted. This was a task someone else had just been told they could not have. She was not certain how to feel about that. After the meeting ended, and the council shuffled out with the careful movements of people recalculating things, she stayed at the table. Leander was reviewing the map his cartographer had unrolled, a large sheet of treated hide covered in careful lines and symbols. His finger moved along the eastern ridge, tracing the curve of it. "You have questions," he said, without looking up. "Why me?" she asked. Because she had learned that asking the question directly was faster and less exhausting than waiting for people to volunteer answers. He looked up then. "Because you found what 11 other people were standing on top of and didn't see," he said. "That is not nothing." She looked at the map. "I have never led anything." "You led yourself through 11 days of digging alone," he said. "Most people stop before the ground gets hard." She did not have an answer for that. She looked at the map again, at the lines representing the ridge she had walked, and felt something unfamiliar move through her. Not quite confidence, not quite belonging. Something earlier than both of those. Something that felt like the water seeping through stone at the bottom of the well. Present, but not yet named. "We leave at dawn," he said. "Bring what you need." She nodded and stood. "Elsie." She stopped. "The coat," he said. He did not look up from the map. "There will be a spare in the supply packs. Take it. The weather on the ridge is worse than the valley." She stood very still for 1 second. "Thank you," she said. He said nothing. His finger continued along the ridgeline. She walked out of the hall into the cold morning air, and behind her, through the closing door, she heard Cato's voice, low and close, saying something to Leander she could not make out. And Leander's reply, quieter still, that she could not hear at all. The ridge was colder than the valley in the way that truth is colder than expectation. Not surprising exactly, but still arriving with more force than you had prepared for. Elsie pulled the new coat tighter around her shoulders as the survey party climbed the eastern slope in the gray light of early morning. It was a good coat. Heavy wool, deep brown, lined with something soft that held warmth, even when the wind pushed through. It was the kind of coat that said someone had thought about the person who would be wearing it. She was not accustomed to that. Ahead of her, the 2 riders, brothers, she had gathered, from the way they spoke to each other in half-sentences, moved with the practiced ease of men who spent most of their lives outdoors. Behind her, the cartographer, a thin older man named Perk, led the pack horse and murmured to himself as he walked, cataloging things she could not see. He had nodded to her once at dawn and said nothing since, which she found comfortable rather than rude. Leander walked beside her. She had expected him to ride. He had not. He had handed his horse to one of the riders at the base of the slope and walked, and now he moved through the frozen grass with the unhurried steadiness of someone who was accustomed to the ground beneath his feet being difficult. They did not speak for the first hour. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of silence between people who were both paying attention to something. The ground in this case, and the way it changed as they climbed. Elsie watched the soil color and the way frost clung differently to different patches of grass. She watched the moss on the exposed rocks. She stopped twice to press her hand to the earth, and both times Leander stopped with her and waited, asking nothing. On the third stop, she found what she was looking for. The ground here was slightly sunken, barely visible, only a hand's width lower than the surrounding surface, forming a long, narrow depression that ran roughly northeast. The grass inside the depression was darker green than the frost-killed grass around it, as if something below had kept it alive past its season. The dark blue-gray stone she had described to Leander appeared here in a long, crooked line, like a seam in old cloth. She traced the line with her eyes, following it along the ridge. "It runs further than I thought," she said. Leander crouched beside the depression and looked at the stone line. "How far?" "Further east than we can walk today." She followed the seam with her gaze until it curved behind a rise and disappeared. "This is the same vein. It is wider here than at the village." Perk had come forward, his notebook already open, a stick of charcoal moving across the page in quick, confident strokes. He made a sound of professional interest. "If the vein runs northeast, it may pass within range of Cold Hollow," he said, naming one of the lower settlements. "And possibly Fenwick." "Mark it," Leander said. Perk marked it. Elsie straightened and looked northeast, where the ridge curved away and the sky sat low and white above the tree line. The wind up here carried pine and cold stone, and the faint mineral smell she had come to associate with deep water, a smell like old silver, clean and slightly sharp. "There is something else," she said. Both men looked at her. She hesitated, because what she was about to say was based on nothing she could name precisely, nothing she could point to or measure or show anyone on a map. It was based on the way the wind moved over the depression, and the particular quality of the cold in this spot, and the sound, almost inaudible, of something very far below shifting. "The vein is being fed from above," she said. "Not from rainfall. From somewhere higher. There is a source." She looked up the ridge, where the slope steepened and the trees thinned. "Up there, I think. Something is holding water, a lake, or a deep basin. And it is draining slowly." Leander looked up the ridge. Then he looked at her. That would explain the Carrow. She turned to him. "If the source basin is draining, losing its seal somehow, then the Carrow drops because it is no longer being fed from above. The water goes underground instead." She paused. "If the seal is broken, the wells will help the settlements. But if someone finds and repairs the seal, the Carrow returns." The silence that followed was longer than the ones before it. Perk had stopped writing. The two Ryder brothers had drifted closer without appearing to, the way trained men do when the conversation has become relevant. Leander looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than surprise. Something that looked like a man revising a map he thought he already knew. "Can you find it?" he asked. "The source." She looked up the ridge again. The slope was steep. The trees above were old pines, dense and dark, and above them the ridge crested against the white sky. It would be a hard climb. It would take the rest of the day to reach the top, and by then, the light would be failing. "Yes," she said. They made camp that night on a sheltered ledge halfway up the upper slope, where the pine trees broke the wind, and the ground was dry enough to lay bedrolls without waking soaked. The riders built a fire with practiced efficiency, feeding it with dead pine and a few sticks of compressed bark from the supply packs that caught quickly and burned long. Elsie sat close enough to the fire to feel it on her face, and far enough not to crowd it, and she ate the dried meat and hard bread from her pack, and watched the flames, and did not think about anything in particular, which was unusual for her. Usually her mind kept working past the point where her body stopped, cataloging problems, rehearsing arguments, building contingencies. Tonight, it was quiet, tired in a way that felt almost like rest. Cato had not come on the survey. She noticed his absence in the way you notice attention you expected and have not yet found. He had looked at her twice more in the hall that morning before they left. Once when she took the coat from the supply pack, and once when Leander confirmed she would lead the approach to the ridge. Each look had been the same. Measuring, withheld, not yet decided. She did not know what he was deciding. She did not know why it stayed in her mind. Leander was sitting on the other side of the fire, speaking quietly with Perk about the map. She could hear the low rhythm of the conversation without making out the words. The back and forth of two people working through something together, disagreeing occasionally, adjusting. He listened when Perk spoke. She noticed that. He did not fill the spaces where the older man was thinking. After Perk rolled up his notes and settled into his bedroll, and after the two riders had arranged themselves on either side of the camp perimeter, in a way that was clearly habitual, Leander looked across the fire at her. "You should sleep," he said. "The upper slope is harder than today." "I know," she said. She did not move. He looked at the fire. "You have never left Ashvin before." It was not a question. She had not said so, and she wondered how he had read it, whether it was something in the way she moved through unfamiliar terrain, or something else. "No," she said. "Is it what you expected? Outside the village?" She considered that honestly. "I did not think much about outside," she said. "There was always enough inside to manage." He was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked and settled. A pine branch somewhere above them shed snow with a soft sound. "What did you think when the council laughed at you?" he asked. She looked at him across the fire. He was watching the flames, not her, which somehow made the question easier to answer. "I thought they might be right," she said. "For a few minutes, on the second day." She paused. "Then I thought, the ground does not know who is holding the shovel. So I kept holding it." He did not respond immediately. The fire moved between them. Then, quietly, he said, "No, it does not." She slept well that night, which surprised her. The ground was hard, and the cold pressed in at the edges of the bedroll, and the pine forest made sounds that were unfamiliar, small shifts and creaks, and the occasional distant call of something nocturnal. But she slept deeply, and without the dreams that usually found her. And when she woke before dawn, to the smell of pine smoke and cold air, she felt something she did not immediately recognize. She felt rested. She lay still for a moment, looking up at the sky through the gap in the pine canopy, where stars were still visible in the last dark before dawn. The camp around her breathed with the slow rhythm of sleeping men. And then she heard it. Low voices. Two of them. Somewhere beyond the far edge of the camp, past the tree line. She sat up carefully. One voice was Leander's. The other was unfamiliar. Not one of the riders. Not Perk. Someone who had not been in the camp when she fell asleep. She rose quietly, pulling the coat around her, and moved toward the trees. She stopped at the edge of the firelight, where the dark began. Two figures stood in the shadow of the pines. Leander, and a man she did not recognize. Older, shorter, wearing a dark riding cloak with the hood still up. He was speaking quickly and quietly, and though she could not hear the words, she could read the posture. Urgency, low-level fear, and something that looked very much like a warning. Leander stood with his arms at his sides and his face in profile. Whatever he was hearing, it was not news he wanted. The stranger handed him something. A small object, dark, that disappeared into Leander's coat. Then the man turned and walked back into the trees, and within moments the sound of a horse moving carefully through undergrowth faded and was gone. Leander stood alone at the edge of the dark for a long moment. Then he turned and saw her. They looked at each other across 10 feet of frozen ground and pine shadow. He did not explain. She did not ask. but something had shifted in his expression. Some layer of the careful neutrality had compressed, and beneath it she caught a glimpse of something tighter, something that looked like a problem he had not yet solved. "Sleep," he said. "We leave at first light." She went back to her bedroll. She did not sleep again. The source was exactly where Elsie had believed it would be. At the crest of the ridge, past the point where the pine trees gave up and the rock took over, the slope opened into a wide natural basin, a shallow bowl carved into the mountain by something ancient and patient. It had once held a lake. The evidence was everywhere. The watermark lines on the surrounding stone, the particular smoothness of the basin floor, the pale mineral crust along what had been the shoreline. Now it held only a thin gray sheet of ice over a much smaller body of water, perhaps a third of what had once been there, retreating toward the center as if trying to disappear. Perk moved along the old water line, making notes with the intensity of a man who had found something significant and was afraid to say so too quickly. The two Ryder brothers stood at the edge of the basin and said nothing, which Elsie had come to understand was their way of expressing that they were unsettled. Leander stood at the center, where the ice was thinnest, looking down through it at the stone below. Elsie walked the rim of the basin slowly, reading the ground the way her mother had taught her. Not with urgency, but with patience, letting the information come to her rather than reaching for it. She passed a section of the southern wall where the rock face was split, a long, jagged crack running from ground level up to twice her height. Around the crack, the stone was darker than the surrounding surface. Wet. She stopped. She pressed her fingers to the crack. Cold water seeped steadily through it, running down the rock face in a thin, continuous sheet, and disappearing into a crevice at the base of the wall. Not draining in, draining out. The basin was losing water through this fracture, had been losing it for some time, long enough to have dropped the water level by 2/3, long enough to have starved the Caro. "Here," she said. Leander was beside her within moments. He looked at the crack, then at the wet stone, then at the thin stream running down to the crevice. His jaw tightened slightly. "How long has it been draining?" he asked. "Long time," she said. "The mineral deposit around the crack is old. This did not happen last month." She traced the edge of the fracture with 2 fingers. Something opened it. Stone does not split like this on its own. Not cleanly. This line is too even. Leander looked at her sharply. "You are saying this was done." "I am saying it did not happen by itself," she said carefully. "I am not saying I know who or why." Perk had come to stand behind them. He looked at the crack for a long moment, then made a sound in his throat that carried the weight of an unpleasant conclusion. "If the fracture is sealed," he said, "the basin refills, the Caro recovers, the settlements regain their water supply." He paused. "But whoever opened this crack knew exactly what they were doing. This is not a random fissure. This is a specific point, the lowest point on the basin wall. Maximum drainage, minimum visibility from below." The word deliberate hung in the air without anyone saying it. One of the Ryder brothers said from behind them, "There are tracks." Everyone turned. He was standing 15 feet to the left of the crack, pointing at the ground near the base of the wall. Elsie moved toward him and looked down. The frost here had preserved them. Boot prints, several sets, overlapping, coming from the northern side of the basin and congregating near the wall. They were not fresh. 2 weeks old, perhaps 3. The edges softened by 1 or 2 light snowfalls. But they were there, and they pointed at the wall, and they pointed away again in the direction of a narrow path that dropped off the north face of the ridge. The north face led away from Ashvin. It led toward the territories of 2 other packs, Greyvale and Dunmar, both of whom shared the Caro's lower watershed. Leander stood very still for a moment, and Elsie watched him think. It was not a visible process. His expression did not change. His posture did not shift. But there was a quality to his stillness that was different from ordinary stillness. The quality of a mind moving very quickly behind a face that had learned not to show it. Then he took the small dark object from his coat, the one the stranger had handed him in the night, and held it in his open palm. It was a carved stone seal, small, flat, the size of a large coin. Pressed into its face was a mark Elsie did not recognize, a circle divided by 3 lines. Dunmar, Perk said quietly. Leander closed his fingers around it. Yes, he said. Elsie looked at the tracks, then at the sealed object in his fist, then at his face. The man in the forest last night, she said. He brought you this. He is one of my contacts in the Northern Territories, Leander said. He found it near the lower end of the Caro Basin 3 days ago. He looked at her steadily. Someone from Dunmar opened this fracture. They have been redirecting the eastern vein underground, toward wells on their own land, while the settlements that depend on the Caro go dry. She absorbed this slowly. They starve the river to feed themselves. And wait, Leander said, for the outer settlements to weaken enough to accept new terms, new alliances, new leadership. His voice remained even, but something beneath it had the quality of controlled anger. Not hot, but very cold. It is a strategy, not an accident. Elsie looked at the fracture in the wall, at the thin, steady stream of water disappearing into the earth. At the shrunken lake behind her, the ghost of a water line still visible on the stone. She thought about 11 days of digging alone, about the laughter, about hauling water from a dying river while 3 men sat by a fire and called it a temporary weather change. She thought about Cold Hollow and Fenwick, and however many other places had people who were doing the same kind of calculating she had always done. How much is left? How long will it hold? What do I cut first? Can it be sealed? She asked. With the right materials and enough hands, Perk said. Stone packing, iron bonding resin, 2 days of work. The fracture is not beyond repair. Then repair it, she said. She said it to Leander, directly, which she realized a second later was not the way people generally spoke to Alpha Kings. But he did not seem to find it inappropriate. He looked at her with that same careful attention that had watched her from the rim of the well, and then he nodded once. We go back to Ashfin today, he said. I need to send word to my garrison before we return to the ridge. He looked at the Ryder brothers. Tell no one what we found here. Not yet. Cato was in the hall when they returned, and whatever he had been doing in their absence had not improved his disposition toward Elsie. She knew this before he spoke. She read it in the way he straightened when she entered, and in the particular set of his shoulders that said he had been thinking about something, and had arrived at a conclusion that displeased him. He waited until Leander had gone to wash and change, and then he appeared at Elsie's elbow near the supply table where she was returning the unused portions of her pack. A word, he said. She turned to face him. Up close, Cato was younger than she had first assessed, perhaps Leander's age or slightly less, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of face that was careful about what it showed. He was not hostile, exactly. He was precise. You have spent 2 days alone on a ridge with the Alpha King, he said, keeping his voice low. And you have come back with a theory about deliberate sabotage that points to Dunmar, a pack we are currently in delicate negotiation with. It is not a theory, she said. The fracture is there. The tracks are there. The seal your lord is carrying was found at the base of the Caro. I know what was found, Cato said. I arranged for it to be found. He paused, letting that register. What I am telling you is that what you uncovered on that ridge has consequences that extend far beyond a village well. And I am asking you, carefully, with respect, to consider whether you understand the size of what you have walked into. She looked at him for a long moment. You have been watching me since the day you arrived, she said. What have you decided?" He was quiet. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere above, the hall's old beams contracted in the cold. "I have decided," he said finally, "that you are exactly what you appear to be, which, in my experience, is either the most trustworthy thing in a room or the most dangerous." He looked at her steadily. "I have not yet determined which." "Neither have I," she said honestly. "About you." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite respect, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as both. He gave a short nod and moved away. That evening, Elsie was crossing the lane between the hall and the storehouse when she heard Elder Brom's voice carrying through the half-open shutter of a side room. "Cannot allow this to continue. She is an Omega from a storage shed. Whatever the AlphaKing believes he sees in her, it will pass, and when it does, we cannot have built our entire water strategy on her word." A second voice, Hadric. "What would you have us do? He has already committed resources." "I would have us remind him," Brom said, "of what she is, who her family was, what her mother was accused of before she died." Elsie stopped walking. The cold wrapped around her and the lane was very dark, and the sound of the fire inside the room was warm and distant, as something from another life. She stood still and waited, and in the silence that followed Brom's words, she heard Hadric say quietly, "That was never proven, Brom." "It does not need to be proven," Brom said. "It only needs to be remembered." She walked the rest of the way to the storehouse with careful, even steps. Inside, alone, she sat on the cold floor with her back against the stone wall and her knees drawn up, and she thought about her mother, who had known water and land, and the deep patience of things that grew slowly, who had been accused, in the last year of her life, of poisoning the Pack's grain stores during a bad harvest, an accusation that had no evidence, that had been raised by the same council that now sat by a warm fire, discussing what she was and where she came from. The accusation had never been resolved. It had simply been left in place, like a stone in a doorway, something to trip over when it was convenient. She pressed the back of her head against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. Tomorrow they would return to the ridge to begin repairing the fracture. Tomorrow there would be work, and the work would be clear, and she was good at clear work. Tonight, she sat with the knowledge that some things followed you, not because they were true, but because they were useful to someone else. And somewhere in the hall, Elder Brom was deciding how useful her past could be. The repair crew arrived at the basin 2 days later, 6 of Leander's garrison wolves, carrying iron tools and leather sacks of bonding resin and enough stone packing material to seal a wall twice the size of the fracture. They moved with the efficiency of men who had done difficult physical work in difficult conditions before, and they asked no questions about why they were doing it, or who had found the damage. They simply worked. Elsie worked with them. She had not been asked to. Leander had suggested, the morning they left, that she could remain in Ashfin and rest after the survey. She had looked at him without speaking for long enough that he had moved on without pressing the point. She took her place beside the stone crew, and when they looked at her, the Omega from the storage shed in her borrowed coat, she picked up a packing mallet and got on with it, and after an hour no one was looking at her anymore because there was too much to do. Cato was there as well. He worked in silence, which she had come to understand was simply how he occupied himself when his mind was busy. He moved stones, mixed resin, called out measurements to the mason who was directing the seal work. Once, when she was struggling to hold a large flat stone in position while the resin was applied, he came and held it without being asked, and they stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold until the mason gave the signal and they both stepped back. He did not comment on it. Neither did she. By the second evening, the fracture was sealed. The mason ran his hands along the repair, pressing at the edges, listening to the stone. Then he stood and said simply, It will hold. They stood at the sealed wall as the light went gray and the temperature dropped, and Elsie looked at the basin. The water level had already risen slightly, barely visible, a finger's width of new waterline against the stone. It would take time. Days, perhaps longer. But the loss had stopped. The source was intact. She thought about the Caro, far below, running thin and gray through Ashvin's valley. She thought about the morning it would begin to rise again, slowly, the way all real things recover, without announcing themselves. Leander came to stand beside her at the basin's edge. "It will take 3 weeks for the river to return to normal," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "The wells you identified will serve the settlements in the meantime." "Yes." He was quiet. The wind moved across the basin and carried the smell of cold stone and pine and something mineral and clean. Somewhere below them, the first repaired well in Ashvin was doing exactly what she had said it would do. "Brahm spoke to me this morning," Leander said. She looked at him. "He told me about your mother," he said. He said it plainly, without softening or sharpening, in the same voice he used for water depths and map coordinates. She waited. "He told me she was accused of poisoning the grain stores," Leander continued. "He told me the accusation was never resolved. He told me, carefully, with great apparent reluctance, that I should consider the character of the source when evaluating the information she provides." Elsie looked back at the water. "And what did you say?" "I asked him for the original record of the accusation." Leander reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Old paper, brittle at the edges, the ink faded but legible. "My archivist carries records of all formal accusations made within packs under my jurisdiction, including accusations that were quietly dropped." He held the document toward her. She took it with hands that were not entirely steady. She read it slowly, her eyes moving through the formal language, the dates, the listed witnesses, her mother's name, the accusation, and then, near the bottom, a line she had to read twice. "Accusation withdrawn by primary witness. Witness stated the claim was made under pressure from council members seeking explanation for harvest shortfall. Signed, Heydrich, Secondary Counsel." She stood very still. Heydrich, who had said, 2 nights ago through a shuttered window, that was never proven, Brahm, because he had known. He had always known. He had signed the withdrawal and said nothing for 4 years. "Your mother was innocent," Leander said quietly. "The record confirms it. The accusation was political. The council needed someone to hold responsible for a bad harvest, and she was the easiest person in the village to blame." Elsie folded the document carefully along its original lines. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had not gone anywhere. It had simply moved inward, to somewhere that did not show. "She died believing the village thought her a poisoner," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am sorry." She looked at the rising water in the basin, at the sealed wall, at the long, hard work of repair. "What happens to Brahm?" she asked. "He will be removed from the council," Leander said. "Heydrich has already agreed to make a formal statement. Elder Senna was not involved. She arrived after the fact. The council will be restructured." He paused. "Ashvin will need new leadership, people who understand what the village actually has and what it is capable of." She looked at him. "I am not suggesting you," he said, and something in his tone came as close to dry humor as she had yet heard from him. "I am suggesting that you might have opinions about who." She almost smiled. It surprised her. The matter of Dunmar took longer to resolve, and it was resolved without violence, which, Cato told her later, was actually the more difficult outcome to arrange. Leander sent formal documentation of the sabotage to the 3 neighboring pack leaders, along with the carved seal and Perk's survey report, and a letter that Cato described only as precise. The Alpha of Dunmar, Faced with the evidence, and with the knowledge that 11 other pack leaders had received the same documents simultaneously, chose the option that preserved the most of what he still had. He admitted to the act. He agreed to pay reparations to the affected settlements. He accepted a reduction in his territory's water rights for a period of 5 years. It was not justice in the way that felt satisfying. It was justice in the way that actually worked, which was quieter and harder to celebrate, but more durable. Elsie learned all of this from Cato, who had taken to debriefing her on events she had not been present for, in the same tone he used for logistics, as if keeping her informed were simply a matter of operational efficiency. She did not point out that he did not have to do this. He did not acknowledge that he was choosing to. It worked for both of them. On the morning that Leander and his party prepared to leave Ashfin, the village was different from the one he had ridden into 3 weeks before. Not dramatically. It did not announce itself. But the eastern well was operational and ringed with new stone, and 2 other sites had been marked for future wells, and the Carrow was 3 fingers higher than it had been at its lowest, and still rising. Brom was no longer in the hall. Senna had taken the council chair with the careful expression of someone who understood they were being given a second chance at something and intended not to waste it, and Elsie stood at the edge of the main square in the new coat, watching the horses being loaded, and felt the strange specific weight of a life that had changed without making a sound. Leander came to her before he mounted. "There is a position," he said, "in the Resource Survey Corps. We document water, soil, land conditions across the Northern Territories. We identify problems before they become crises." He looked at her steadily. "It requires traveling, extended periods away from a fixed location. The work is outdoor, physical, often uncomfortable." She looked at him. "You are describing my last 3 weeks." "Yes," he said. "What does it pay?" "Enough for a coat that fits properly," he said. She looked down at the borrowed coat. Too wide at the shoulders, too long in the sleeve, warm as anything she had ever owned. Then she looked at the well. She had built that. 11 days alone with a shovel on ground no one believed in. And she had built it. And it would stand here long after everyone who had laughed at her had been forgotten. Her mother's name would be cleared. The record existed now, signed and archived and impossible to quietly drop. The river was rising. She had done what she came to do. Now there was more ground to read, more stone to learn, more water hidden in places no one had thought to look. "When do we leave?" she said. They rode out of Ashfin as the morning opened, Leander and his riders, Perk with his maps and his notebook, Cato on a gray horse that suited his precise nature, and Elsie on a brown mare that the garrison had produced from somewhere, riding with the posture of someone learning a new thing carefully and refusing to pretend otherwise. She did not look back at the village. She had looked back enough times in her life. She had spent years looking backward at a place that had never fully turned toward her. Her mother was at peace in the ground, and her name was clean in the record, and the well would give water to people who had laughed, and people who had not, and people who had not yet been born, because water does not ask who deserves it. She looked forward, at the road rising through the frost-white valley toward the wider territories beyond. Beside her, Cato guided his horse into step with hers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The gesture was its own kind of statement. A man who had spent 3 weeks deciding what she was, and had arrived at an answer he was comfortable enough with to ride beside. Ahead of them, Leander set the pace. Steady, unhurried. The pace of someone who knew the distance and was not trying to outrun it. Perk was already drawing in his notebook from the saddle. The Ryder brothers were arguing amiably about something just ahead. And Elsie rode into the wider world with her hands easy on the reins, a cleared name in an archive somewhere behind her, and the smell of pine and cold stone and distant water ahead. The smell, she was learning, of ground that was willing to give, if you were only willing to ask. The Carrow ran full again by the first day of the new month. the people of Ashfin woke to find the riverbanks wet, and the current strong and the water clear, and most of them did not know precisely why, and some of them thought it was the weather turning, and a few of them remembered a woman with a shovel on the eastern edge and said nothing, and one of them, a girl of perhaps 8 years, who had watched from the doorway of her family's house every morning while the digging went on, went to the well and looked down into the dark water below and said, to no one in particular, she found it. Senna heard her say it. She wrote it down. Elder Brahm left Ashfin quietly, in the manner of men who understand that the window for a graceful exit is closing. He settled in a small holding to the south, where no one knew him as anything other than an old man who kept to himself. The council he had led for 9 years restructured itself without ceremony, and got on with the business of governing, which turned out to run considerably more smoothly when the people doing it were primarily interested in the village, rather than in themselves. Hadric made his formal statement, signed it, and spent the rest of his years doing the quiet, useful work of a man paying back a debt that could not be fully paid. He repaired fences. He helped with harvests. He made sure the well stones were kept clear of ice each winter. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. He did it anyway. Leander did not return to Ashfen for 2 years. When he did, it was not as a king conducting an assessment. It was briefly, in passing, on a longer route north. He stopped at the well and looked at it for a moment. The careful stonework, the mortar lines, the iron stake still driven into the ground where the rope had been anchored. And then he rode on. He had, in the 2 years between, restructured the Northern Water Survey Corps, formalized the process for identifying underground veins, and named the documentation standard after the method Elsie had used on the ridge. He had not announced this. It was simply in the records, and the people who used it learned its name the same way they learned most useful things, through repetition, until the name and the method were inseparable. Elsie was not in Ashfen when he passed through. She was 3 days east, at the crest of a ridge she had not been on before, pressing her palm flat against the cold, dark earth and listening to what the ground was willing to say. The survey team waited behind her. 5 people now, experienced, trained in the method, wearing good coats. Cato was among them, as he usually was, his notebook open, his charcoal moving. She felt the familiar suggestion beneath her hand. Not yet water, but the memory of water. The shape the ground makes when it is holding something back. She stood. Here, she said, and they began.